Homage to the Triple Gem. So I was asked a question on Discord a couple days ago relating to jhanas. And the discussion on the server, on the messages back and forth, had been around how to practice breath meditation and on relinquishing perceptions in increasingly refined ways to focus more on the present moment. And the discussion had touched on a point that if one can go behind the perception of the mind itself, then a feeling of bliss can arise for one who practices with that level of refinement, with that level of diligence, and with consistency. So the question based on that was, this gentleman had said, my understanding is that there can, just paraphrasing, there can be this kind of feeling that arises in meditation, which is like a dopamine hit. Kind of sounded like something you would get from taking a drug or something, and that this is a coarse type of feeling, and it's not to be confused with the actual bliss that the Buddha was talking about when he was referring to piti, the feeling in the first jhana. So he was asking, if in that particular back and forth discussing jhanas, talking about bliss, what does bliss mean? So, first of all, it's important to understand the way that sensual pleasures graph versus the pleasures of meditation graph. So in economics, they have this phrase which is called the law of diminishing returns. So I believe, it's been a long time since I've taken economic courses, but that the more that one consumes something, the less pleasure that gives. So no matter what, if you get 1 unit of hamburger and you consume it, the second unit is less pleasant, the third unit is less pleasant. And another aspect of sensual pleasures is that the happiness one gets from a sensual pleasure depends on contrast. So if one is really hungry, then food is more pleasant than if one is not hungry. If one's eaten a full meal, and even if one gets a hamburger, one hasn't even eaten a single hamburger, but one is full, then that hamburger is not as pleasant. So sensual pleasure depends on lack, and it diminishes the more of it one gets. And this is what can lead to addictive tendencies with sensual pleasure. Another aspect of sensual pleasure, tying into the addictive tendencies, is that consuming the sensual pleasure doesn't tend to lead to increased mindfulness. Actually, I've mentioned many times, the pleasure that one is looking for in consuming a sensual pleasure is often the pleasure of distraction. So when one is swept away consuming a burger, consuming whatever type of delicious meal it might be, that sweeping away is not making one more mindful. It's making one less mindful. And in consuming these things, becoming less mindful and requiring more of it, these are some of the patterns that lead to an addiction. This kind of one needs to consume more of something to get the same hit of distraction. And the more of it that one consumes, the less there is. And even the ability to enjoy it depends on its lack. And all the while, it's spiraling downwards. It's kind of leading to less mindfulness, leading to less clarity, less calm. So the overconsumption of these sensual pleasures spirals down, doesn't spiral up. The pleasure of meditation is a different type of meditation. Is a different type of pleasure. It's not a pleasure that diminishes, it's a pleasure that increases the more that one puts the causes for it into place. And it's not a pleasure that depends on lack. It's a pleasure that depends on production. So it's a productive pleasure, not a consumptive pleasure. You don't consume something and consuming it is, this overwhelming experience that you get right up front and then diminishes over time. The pleasure for meditation is a pleasure of production. You put the causes into place, and the causes start small but grow larger. So they don't start as this overwhelming experience. They start as a small experience that grows larger, and the more that one does it, the more that pleasure can increase. So this graphs in a different way than sensual pleasure. It's not the type of pleasure that is big up front and diminishes. It's a pleasure that starts small when one puts the causes into place and increases. Another aspect of the pleasure of meditation is that it leads to increased mindfulness. You have to have mindfulness and clear comprehension, basically, to be able to generate pleasure in your meditation. So this type of pleasure is graphing in a really different way than sensual pleasure. So the more that one engages in this type of practice, the more that one is able to gain this type of pleasure, the more mindful that one can become. The more at ease one's mind is, the less subject it is to negative emotions. It's not a pleasure that depends on blanking out. If one blanks out, then it goes away. The pleasure can go away. So it graphs in a different way, and it's given a different name. The name that it's given is the pleasure of form. It's a type of pleasure that arises based on the form of the body felt from within. And that's one of the reasons why the Buddha, probably the reason why the Buddha gave the name for this type of pleasure, form. So if a person practices the jhanas, then they go to a Brahma realm, which is called the form realm. If they just keep the precepts, which is still excellent, and practice generosity, they stay in the sensual realms, which are all these really high heavens before the Brahma realms, going down to the animal realm, and I think even that realm of hungry ghosts, maybe even hell is included in there. So this is a different scale. It's not the same category. It's a different category of pleasure. And the first time that one experiences that pleasure, even if one has had drugs, one has had companionship with, had a girlfriend or a boyfriend, whatever. One has eaten really nice types of food. One has had success in life, as people would generally define success, making money or being praised by other people. The first time one experiences that type of pleasure, the first thought one may think is that this is the best feeling. One may think this is the best feeling I've ever had in my life up to this point. So it's a completely separate category of pleasure from the pleasure that one can derive from anything external. Consumptive pleasures depend on this external object that you essentially feed on. You consume it. This is the pleasure of form is a productive pleasure. You produce it by focusing more and more on the present moment, generally, and letting the 5 hindrances fall away. So there can be this idea, theoretically, that there's some kind of dopamine rush that you can get within meditation that's equivalent to some type of bliss. Before this question, and my understanding is that there's some discussion going on the internet about this, but I've never heard of that happening to anybody in meditation, where they have some kind of drug-like dopamine dump from practicing meditation. Generally, unless somebody puts the causes into place to be mindful, be in the present moment, keeping sati sampajanya, or staying with one single object, reducing the amount of thinking in the mind, and staying more and more in the present moment, then this type of pleasure doesn't arise for people. Actually, meditation can be very, very difficult. I mean, you don't hear about people going on retreats and ending up in some junkie state where they get this type of pleasure and it comes, and then it's so indulgent, and then they get it again. They can get it really easily again, and then it's kind of every time they consume it, it gets less or something like this, and they're just getting less mindful all the time, and it doesn't graph the same way as a sensual pleasure. It's not like a burger where anybody can just go up and jump up and eat it and get it whenever they want. It's something that one has to put the causes into place for. So this is one of the reasons why you don't hear about people entering the jhanas, becoming very good at the jhanas, and they seem all strung out by being on the jhanas. And it's one of the reasons why it doesn't graph the same way as a dopamine hit, where dopamine hits, if you keep consuming something that releases all kinds of dopamine, then your body just starts producing less dopamine, or something like this. Your body actually adapts to that. So this graphs in a totally separate direction. So generally, this seems to be a kind of theoretical angle that can be taken by some people now, that there's this type of pleasure you can get during meditation that's a dopamine hit, and be careful of that. And then there's another type of pleasure that's more in line with the suttas, that's almost indistinguishable from normal life, or it's just a normal pleasure, which comes like after you keep the precepts and these things. And that distinction is one that's theoretical. It's as I mentioned, in all the time I've been a monk, I've never heard until this kind of these modern day discussions. I'd never heard of this this kind of this thing happening to anybody before, this theory happening to anybody before. So what will probably tend to happen is that people will hear about other people having these experiences of bliss by focusing in on a single object, And then they themselves will externally classify that person's feeling as being a dopamine hit or coming under sensuality. But again, this pleasure that comes from production, from focusing on the present moment, from letting the mind still, this is not part of sensuality. This is part of the pleasure of form. So it's a very important pleasure to cultivate. The first time that a person experiences this, even the lower ones, the first jhana, then all their problems can disappear. And they can be in whatever type of external situation, whatever can be happening to them, and none of that will matter. And they may even feel like, I could just stay in this situation indefinitely, so long as I could, so long as I could keep producing this feeling. So it's a type of pleasure that one can develop in order to separate the mind from sensuality. It's precisely because the mind has this more stable source of food to feed on that it doesn't rely on the unstable sources of food outside. So the Buddha gives a simile of a fortress and describes right concentration as the food of the fortress. He describes knowing many different suttas as the weapons that are stored in the fortress, and gives a number of different metaphors. But right concentration is the food. So if you have this type of pleasure that's internal, then external sensual pleasures pose less of a temptation, and their loss is less of a threat. Because essentially the mind, as it's climbing the ladder, as one is practicing, trying to develop in one's practice, it still needs some kind of happiness, so they get depressed. So this kind of pleasure, the cultivation of this kind of pleasure, is an important aspect of the path. It's called samadhi. That's why the Buddha recommends it very, very strongly. So the jhanas as well, it's important to note, they're a superhuman state in the Buddha's teaching. So they're not a normal thing. They're not like a normal feeling that one has had thousands or hundreds of thousands of times throughout one's life when one was just got a good feeling from being generous, from being virtuous. It's a feeling separate from that, which is why the Buddha lists them as separate categories: sila, samadhi, panya. There is this sutta in which the Buddha says, for a person who's virtuous, no effort needs to be made for joy to arise. For a person who's joyful, no effort needs to be made. I think for concentration, there's a number of different links in that, but each one says no effort needs to be made. So from that, some people argue that if you're keeping sila, essentially you're already in samadhi. The logical flaw there is that sutta doesn't just stop at samadhi, it goes all the way to nibbana. So in that case, keeping sila would be the same as nibbana, which obviously doesn't make much sense. So reading the suttas, one has to understand a number of different things about them. For one thing, they were codified at the first council, and this is known. So in order for monks to memorize them, they have to be in a particular repeatable fashion, something that's easy to repeat and memorize. Another thing is just the way that language is used in general. Because they're stylized and because they point at different aspects of the path, language is sometimes not used in the same way as like a precise technical vocabulary. And it can be, if you have joy, you basically don't need to put an effort for your mind to enter samadhi. It doesn't mean necessarily that that's always going to be automatic every time, because you can see many instances, especially there's an instance with Venerable Pali, who is the Buddha's chief, the foremost in the Vinaya, and likely helped to codify a lot of the Sutta Vibhanga. He is the foremost in the Vinaya, so obviously keeping sila. But one time he wanted to go off into seclusion and practice in the forest, and the Buddha said, "Don't go." He said, "It's when my disciples see the first jhana in themselves, the second jhana," and he goes all the way up through all the 8 concentration attainments. So you have an example of the person who's chief, foremost in the Vinaya. He's keeping sila, obviously, excellently, but he doesn't have samadhi at that time. So one has to read the suttas as a whole and understand that they're the way that they've been constructed in a stylized way, and then take the meaning from them in the same way that one would take meaning from people using a normal type of language. Not a technical vocabulary, but a normal type of vocabulary which can be contextual. So it's enough to say that the jhanas, feelings of bliss that arise in the mind, if a feeling of bliss arises for the person in the mind that they've never experienced before in their life, that makes all their problems seem to disappear. And that makes them feel much less threatened about losing any external sensual pleasure. those are good characteristics, good signs for that to be the pleasure of form. And it's not going to be a dopamine hit for people. It's going to be something that graphs opposite to a dopamine hit. It won't go down. It won't become smaller and smaller and smaller. The more one consumes it, it doesn't diminish in terms of the more one consumes it, or the more one the more one gets of it, the less potent it becomes. Rather, it increases the more that one continues to put these causes into place. And it serves as a firm foundation in the mind. It serves as a source of food so that one can have enough strength to launch one's assault on the defilements that plague, that trouble one. Because the mind needs this safe place to rest. The mind needs this place that's free, more free from worry, more free from fear. And so in order to let go of these external things, like one's various sensual pleasures, even up to the body itself, it's important to cultivate this as a skill, which is why the Buddha highly recommends it.